And we're back, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, to episode 1 of a little podcast I wanted to get started this week. There's only me, so no guests, but that doesn't mean that I won't bring some on if anybody ends up checking it out. I wanted to do sort of an improvised, off-the-cuff talking about one of my favorite hobbies. Now, I've got YouTube and Jeff the Narrator and our Let's Plays, our Let's Role Plays, and our video essays, but something that consumes a lot of my creative time is dungeon mastering or game mastering. And originally, when I first made the channel back in 2022, that is what I wanted to do. Some of the very first episodes I have are little 1 minute, 5 minute, what's an RPG? So, I've come a long way since then. I'm older, wiser, and I've got a much better microphone. So, let's just start talking tabletops. So what is a tabletop role-playing game? Well, these days you may know very popular names from internet actual plays, or maybe you have been a player or a dungeon master or a game master at your own table. Maybe you've hosted or used a table at a community space like a gamatorium or a local game store. Or maybe you've hosted virtual tabletops on Discord or Roll20. I can only speak to the handful of campaigns that I've been a part of, and I kind of wanted to go through my journey in that today. So, Jeff, yes, where did I first start getting into the hobby? Well, I had always been aware of the hobby, though, due to the fact that the breakout of about 2016, 2018 hadn't happened yet, with shows like Critical Role and Geek and Sundry hosting that. I was very aware of it being the butt of jokes and it not being very cool and being essentially social suicide as a young person growing up. And so I always thought, well, you know, I might be nerdy, I might be a gamer, or I might like fantasy and sci-fi, but I would never be that nerdy. No, never. And actually, I remember having a conversation with a girl once that I was talking to, and we ended up dating for several years, but I remember very vividly a moment where we were driving down a highway, and we were doing the getting to know you talk. A little bit more, this is more than, oh, I know you from school, or I know you from church, or I know you from social ability in college. So let me start to get to know who you are, like who is Jeff, who is, insert name of girl here. And she said, yeah, I mean, I like nerdy things, I'm very casual with games. It's not my main entertainment. I prefer books and movies and shows. I'll do family game nights and stuff like that. But you're not super nerdy, right? You're not very nerdy. And I was like, well, what do you mean? Well, like what's that thing that people do where they're in the basement and they don't see the sky? And two things came to mind. One was World of Warcraft and near on professional or obsession rating, or she was talking about tabletop RPGs, or as I knew it, Dungeons and Dragons, D&D. And to understand where I'm coming from when I make this next statement, you've got to understand that I have had an experience where I would rather obscure my actual interests than to face social ridicule. I was bullied for being nerdy, a little bit of a gamer, I was very social as a child, I think that really you end up seeing a lot of that in middle school. Middle school was rough, but I would hide or lie about my personal interests because I didn't want people to think I was childish, uncool, or something was wrong with me. Because at the time, you're only spending all of your time doing video games, or you're only, you're not living a real life. You're never going to be able to come forward in life. You'll kind of be infantilized, or like you'll be held back by your enjoyment of this. And for me, no one will ever want you if you're a nerd, things like that. No one's going to want to be your friend, social ridicule, social outcast. So I had my people that I could be myself with, but anybody else I would very much change who I was. And unfortunately, it took me a long time to get over that. You should always try to be your most authentic self, because that is the you that people will either decide you are their kind of person, or they will decide that you are not. But you get to sleep at night knowing that you're not hiding. And I think that's very important. Not really related to tabletops the way I thought it was going to be, but it is. So I said, I would never do that. And then I put the hobby from my mind. At the time, I was very early in community college. I was actually going for animation and game design through IT. Anybody who knew me knew that I was doing animation and game design, but for anybody that didn't know me, or anybody that asked that I didn't trust with that information for my major, I said, I'm just going into IT. Yeah. And so I was at this community college, and I remember it was so weird to be around people who were excited about animation and game design. My game design professor was so good at fostering a think tank kind of environment. And I met some of my very dearest friends. We were at a community and technical college, so everybody was either 20 years older than us, or they were doing IT and or nerdy things. There was the culinary program and the forensics department as well, but we didn't really travel in the same social circles exactly. So after a pretty bad breakup, with that same girl, actually, I fell out of my normal social area and fell back on these friends from college. We'll refer to them by their online handles for clarity, but the Boy Lumber and Hellscream were my two best friends, and they really helped me out. We're talking driving around listening to breakup songs until 3 a.m. several times, a week, then going into class and dealing with all that. And then eventually we graduated, and then we just kept doing things. And we would have gaming marathons, we'd have movie nights, all the things. Having a great time. And they're helping me get over this breakup. And that's when I was at a local bookstore. Our local mall is called Books A Million. And I started seeing, the tabletop section was actually its own section instead of board games. And I've been trying and failing to really have a good idea for a game. You know, I graduated with an associate's degree, but I couldn't afford to pay out of pocket for true university to pursue my bachelor's, and I didn't qualify for any kind of financial aid. And so I kind of gave up on that, and I began in the winter of 2018, going into 2019, I purchased. I floated the idea around my friends first, and at this point we had become aware of Critical Role and actual plays and everything like that. And I remember seeing this video on Geek and Sundry called Vampire the Masquerade. It was some sort of a podcast, and it had a high production value. People were in costume, and they were dressed as vampires. And I like dark monster horror, where you kind of wrestle with the humanity of the person in general. I mean, Gary Oldman in Bram Stoker's Dracula is phenomenal because he is an absolute monster. But that opening section where he actually becomes a vampire and he stabs the stone cross and drinks the blood, almost out of this tragic spite, has always resonated very, very deeply with me, because it's just great cinema. I don't even know if that was really Gary Oldman who played Vlad Tempest, but he plays Dracula later in the movie. And so I saw adults fairly older than me, and the storyteller, shout out to Mr. Jason Carl. I know that he's no longer with White Wolf, but he was my Matt Mercer before I had even seen Matt Mercer. He was so knowledgeable about the game, but he was also a mediator. He was a pace setter for the story, and it was collaborative. And I could tell that these people were actors. Apologies to the phenomenal actress who played Nellie G, but Alexander Ward as Jasper, B. Dave Walters as Victor Temple. Oh, fantastic. A Ventrue, a Nosferatu. Nellie played a Toreador. And of course, Erika Ishii as the Bruja, Annabelle. I also should mention that I was aware of Vampire the Masquerade because of the PC game Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines. Phenomenal game. I want to see if I can make it stable enough to run on the channel, but I remember never really getting past the Santa Monica Pier area. But I remember being so enthralled by the IP, I kept making new characters. And so I became interested. Then I became invested in the story. It was like a radio drama, but it was improvised. Things could happen, and you had this element that made things very unpredictable. That was the variable of rolling dice. So I'm super immersed. And the algorithm actually took over. And all of a sudden I'm getting all sorts of things. I'm getting, Dimension 20. I'm getting Critical Role at this point. But I'm also getting Table Story. And so I'm a huge Harry Potter fan. And Table Story ends up doing completely homebrew system based on Powered by the Apocalypse. But they released the rules for free. This was around the time that the cancel culture was really swelling with J.K. Rowling, and the whole the wizarding world belongs to the fans thing was happening. And Whack Steven ends up coming out with this adaptation of the wizarding world, grades 1 through, I think that it was statted out to be about 1st through 5th year, but you could run and stack the entire thing through 7th. And really it had the bones for more. So Whack, if you're ever thinking about picking that up, oh, please. But they did witchcraft and wizardry, and this was in the lull of probably season 2 to 3 of Vampire the Masquerade. LA by Night was the full program. You can still find it on Geek and Sundry. Phenomenal. And I ended up, and now that I think about it, I see so many very talented actors that I see now in other actual plays that I first saw completely ignorant of the entire medium. I saw it first with Vampire the Masquerade, and then Witchcraft and Wizardry happens a little bit later. But Jason Carl presented the role of storyteller so well that I actually pitched an idea to my friends. I said, hey, if I spent the money and I get the core rule book of Vampire the Masquerade, this is V5, and I grab some of the proprietary dice, because if we're going to do it, I want to do it right, would we be able to have a game? They said, yeah, who all could we go with? And so I went with the Boy Lumber, my buddy, Hellscream, my other buddy, college buddies, and then the Boy Lumber's long-term girlfriend at the time. And I remember using my work computer to print out some character sheets, and I pored over it for days until finally I was ready to run a practice session. It went very badly, but my buddy, the Boy Lumber, had a good enough time that he thought that everybody else would like it. So we all get together, and the really good thing about the storyteller system from White Wolf is that it's very simple. You use one kind of dice, it's the D8, and the entire experience of being a kindred, this is the term for vampires, is that you are constantly battling with your inner beast, your inner hunger, which is, in Jason Carl's style and the system, is normally advocated for by the storyteller or the GM. And you've got to be in a place where you want to tap into that. But so we end up doing it, and the core rule book says you can do a major city, but it has to be a city that you know of well or can have access to maps. And it is very recommended that you actually have it in your hometown. So a ton of the regular prep work is finished, but I have the unique challenge now of having to take my hometown, which is rural Appalachia. we're around one of the bigger cities, but still you end up having this big issue. The world's already created, but how do I make it a vampire story? So I take the city, and then I start thinking back about what I know about the lore. Well, Vampire the Masquerade is one one chapter in the entire world of darkness. So, being rural, there is no lore for Appalachia. But it's assumed that a lot of Appalachia is actually owned by the Gauru, or Werewolf the Apocalypse. So I thought, okay, well, let me take a look at the culture. We're a college town, but we're a smaller college town. What else can I look at? Well, there's a city to the northeast, which is very, very capital oriented. And then even farther north, but more northwest, is another huge college town. So I thought, okay, well, what if the Camarilla is coming from this long-standing institution, and the Anarch free movement is coming out of this other, a little bit more urban area, a little bit more modern? What if our hometown is no man's land for that, and in between these big urban pockets are tribes of werewolves? Okay, well, so then we get the growing pains of creating a party, and this very quickly grew. Brigadier Gray, another friend from college, ended up coming in, and he's a very experienced player, and a very experienced GM. And he brought to the table a member of the ministry, and he had enough humor, because he's a natural jokester, that he was a joy to have. But he also had the intelligence and the stats to play an absolutely great social game. The Boy Lumber very much leans into charisma builds in regular role-playing games like Fallout or the Elder Scrolls. So he wanted to do that. We go to Ventru, and you're very blue-blooded. So what does it mean when you are moonlighting as your descendant and you've got to bring your son into the family in your Camarilla? Well, you've got to get that approved. Hellscream played a Brujah, and then the Boy Lumber's girlfriend played a Tremere, because she loves all things witchy. And so the Boy Lumber, his girlfriend, let's call her Gretchen, because Gretchen was actually the name of that character's sire. But this is all a super long time ago, so bear with me. She brings in another friend. I'll call him Benny. And he made another Tremere, which I originally thought, well, you're not supposed to mix classes. However, this was a great lesson in it for me. Benny made another Tremere, but he made it in a way that operated separately from Gretchen's. And so we have Gretchen, who is a former nurse, now turned and dead. She's going to be a bagger because she doesn't believe in, being a monster. Great. And the other is a transient, where he can't, it's not that he can't, but he doesn't, one of his hindrances was that he did not have a domain. He did not have a haven. So he would break into a new building every night. Very dynamic. And we end up having a session 0 where I can kind of practice one more time with the Boy Lumber and his girlfriend. And then I made my first error. I made a DMPC because I needed to see what it looked like from a player's perspective. And it also, I had been looking at the rules. I knew how it worked the most. And so I wanted to show them examples of what they could do. And so I made a character. He was a Brujah called James. And he was a local thug who ended up being turned and one of the Anarch style factions in the No Man's Land was ruled by a Brujah biker gang. And so Chains, he could rough it up, he could mix it up hand to hand, but he also had an improvised weapon in that of a chain that he would use as a improvised belt, and he could use it to grapple and stuff like that as a specialty. And so I did their first night as Kindred. They died, they came back, and oh no. So they played their first few moments of life, and then they died. And they had to acclimate within the next couple days of being Kindred in their hometown, and they had knowledge of the town. And so what was really cool about that was that there was less buy-in. In later campaigns, really selling the world would become so much more important. But it was great. And then we end up getting a new guy at work around the time that we're having session 2. And we'll call him Hunterman, because that's his online tag. And I remember when Hunterman first, I was working in a pawn shop at the time, and I remember when he first came in, people had told me he was a transfer from another branch of the pawn shop chain, and people had told me that he was a big Star Wars fan. And so, you know, being a nerd, being a couple years older, very nice guy, love him to death. He's like a brother to me. And I decided I want to see, you know, on what scale, you know, he is. So I remember saying something like, so you like Star Wars, huh? Are we talking like Darth Plagueis the Wise levels, or like deeper lore? Deeper lore? Well, what do you mean? Well, okay, well. And then so we started talking, and eventually it came out that we were doing a tabletop, and he said, oh man, I love D&D. I said, well, I don't know anything about D&D, but I'm doing Vampire the Masquerade. Do you like vampires? He said, yeah, sure. I said, okay, well, you know, I'll talk it over with my people. We're getting ready to start session 2. Why don't I make you a dedicated NPC to play and see if you like it? And so Hunterman comes in, and we are going through it. And about maybe 2 hours in, he looks at me and he's like, oh, I love this. Yeah. But I'm not really connecting with the character. And I said, okay, well, do you have an idea of what you want to do? He said, yeah, I do. I said, okay. Well, we'll work on that at work in our spare time. And do you want a good death? So, yeah. So I also learned a new skill. That was establish a threat level without just murking a player. You know, Hunterman is going to be coming back as his own character. I'm going to have fun with it. And so I introduce the fact that they've been very messy, and the Inquisition has sent a hit squad. And there were more puzzles, but they're in the sewer, and he ends up taking a flamethrower in a sewer tunnel. It was horrible. But I was able to show them one of their key weaknesses, which is fire. And not even jumping in the river or the sewage is guaranteed to save you. And so eventually, unfortunately, and we ended up bringing in Hunterman's girlfriend in on that as well, and she made a gangrel. Hunterman himself made a Malkavian, which the amount of talent that Hunterman has with voices cannot be understated. And so he was able to naturally do this very, very hard kind of character to play, which is a Malkavian, which is that crazy schizophrenic psychosis that really I've only seen really handled well in the Bloodlines PC game. I haven't played Bloodlines 2 yet, but I hear that there's a big deal with Malkavians being in your head in that one, but I haven't really jumped into that one yet. Unfortunately, the campaign ended up ending abruptly due to a breakup between the boy Lumber and Gretchen, and we tried to salvage it. Unfortunately, it's just one of those things. It wasn't going to work out. Regardless, we ended up coming back, and Brigadier Gray tried, due to the same issue, did a very brief edition of the Star Wars role-playing game from Fantasy Flight Games, now Edge Studios. So I bought Edge of the Empire, and we were just going to try that out, because I really wanted to avoid D&D. I don't know, it was intimidating. I felt like these other ones could do it better. And so we end up exploring Vampire the Masquerade for probably 15 sessions. And we were playing every week. It was the dream. Then we did 2 sessions of Edge of the Empire. And then I bought, foolishly, the original Deadlands from Pinnacle Entertainment. But this was not Savage Worlds. This was, it was Savage Worlds, but it was like 20 years ago Savage Worlds. And the rules were very, very complex. Our group had also grown to about 12 or 15. And the boy Lumber was going to try his hand at DMing. Brigadier Gray was fantastic. I loved being a player for the first time. The boy Lumber had a great idea, but due to personal scheduling, a group of 15 for your first table is intense for anybody, and that just ended up kind of dying off. Then I ended up getting the collector bug, and I bought the entirety of the source books for the Fantasy Flight Star Wars RPG. I bought Edge of the Empire, Age of Rebellion, Force and Destiny. I bought all of the Era source books, which is Dawn of the Rebellion, Collapse of the Republic, and Rise of the Separatists before that chronologically. I bought all of the source books for each of the careers, and several source books like the Corellian Sector, the Hutt Space, and then all of the bestiary, the speeders, everything like that. And I ended up running a campaign with the boy Lumber, Hellscream, and Hunterman. And I did this is probably the second longest campaign I've ever ran. We probably ran 20 sessions, but I did a Star Wars story set right before Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon go to Naboo in order to speak to the Trade Federation. I said, I want you all to be Padawans during the 10-year gap between the Phantom Menace and the Attack of the Clones. But I had to do a session 0, and so what I did was I used a little bit of a hybrid system, and I gave them the Jedi Padawan career access to it for free, but I didn't give them any extra XP. And then I had them take a Force and Destiny career so that they could grow into the way that they were a Jedi. If you wanted to progress through the actual Order of the Jedi, you had to get down to each Force rating at the bottom of each of the Jedi careers. So, if you want to be considered ready for the trials, you've got to take the Force rating upgrade in Padawan, Then you can do a quest and see if you can earn Knight, and then General, and then Master. Though becoming a General is completely optional during the Clone Wars. So we do a Trial of the Gathering, and they are overseen by Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan Kenobi. And really, they were set as set dressing. They were familiar characters, they were iconic characters that could help sell that you were in Star Wars. They were at the Jedi Temple on Ilum to get their Kyber crystals, and I used the Virgins of the Force to help them establish their connection to the Force, what they were dealing with, and begin playing with, issues that would be their dark side. If Anakin was too old because he had a developed attachment to Shmi, his mother, what is that for these other kids? And then I made one. When I assigned them Jedi Masters, I assigned the boy Lumber, hilariously, Kinto Marek, Starkiller's father. He was a huge The Force Unleashed fan. I thought, you know what? With the kind of character that he wants to make, somebody who's not going to really always agree with the Jedi Order, but agree with their morality, Kinto, who was an exile before Order 66, would be a really good one. And I played around really hard with the canon of this. I mixed homebrew with legends with new canon. And whenever you do a campaign set in an established IP, you've really got to watch an issue that actually The Mandalorian Season 2 and 3 struggled with, which was cameo apocalypse. But we're fans. It's not that serious. Let's have some fun with it. So I say that to say I wanted there to be an eventual tie-in with Starkiller during the events of the campaign, if they lasted that long. So I made a tie that Kinto Marek was the apprentice of Rom Koda. We don't know if that's the case. If someone does know the case, and I'm wrong, very sorry, but we know that Rom Koda's Jedi Padawan was actually a Jedi called Fallon Gray. But for the campaign, for this canon, that's fine. My goal was I wanted them to be able to watch the movies and say, hey, during this scene, weren't we here? And that, thankfully, ended up being the case. So we do the Trial of the Gathering. They end up becoming Padawan learners. Hunterman made a Twi'lek called Darmol, and I remember he was the son of a Force-sensitive woman. I think she may have even been a Jedi, but it was very taboo. She ended up giving Darmol to the Jedi because she had a child. But the father ended up taking her, taking Darmol, and was very, very disturbed by the Sith culture and actually tattooed Sith designs all over Darmol's face and Leku. Is it Leku for the Twi'leks? Tails. Head tails. And so a really good one there was I assigned Prosit Dibs as his Jedi master because he was a Miro Allen. He was naturally blind, they didn't have eyes, and they saw through the Force. So I thought that was a really good teacher to have with Darmol because his skin didn't matter. His skin never mattered, but you can really take that from someone who only sees you as a Force entity. With Hellscream, he made a Jedi Master. He made a Zabrak named Toga. And unfortunately, his master escapes me, actually. Because, really, he ended up shining a whole lot better as a master himself. And then the boy Lumber had a character named Arturo, who was a half Dathomirian, half human. And due to some fandom, some headcanon, we had that he was a illegitimate half-brother of Bail Organa. Big fan of the Organas, wanted to have a tribute. It's a game. That's fine. When you're a game master or a storyteller and you're playing as referee for these players, you're told by other prominent GMs that you've got to toe the line between being an arbiter of the rules and really not wanting to say no, say yes and. And so I actually had a very long-standing issue with spoiling my players. If I made a mistake with the rules, I would give them free XP. This is an incentive for me to learn the rules better, and it keeps them hyper vigilant about the rules so that they learn them too. This ended up being to my detriment when my vampires were extremely, extremely powerful, and then now these Padawan learners are getting extra XP because I'm having trouble with the system hopping. We were still having fun, and it made me a better game master. So we do a couple of introductory missions, and we end up with a security job on Nal Hutta. And Toga, the Zabrak, ends up overhearing Count Dooku speaking with some of the separatists who are beginning to petition the Hutts. And that was how I was first going to tease the coming of the Clone Wars. There were several other moments, and eventually they do end up becoming powerful enough to take the trials. Now, at some point between this, Anakin Skywalker does end up becoming more prevalent in the story because, again, you want to adhere, to your player's attempted character arc. And Darth Maul, played by Hunterman, really wanted to have a connection with Anakin because if he made it to Order 66, he wanted to have that gut punch to try to see if maybe he could be one of the very few people who knew about Anakin. So, very sparingly, you would see Anakin pop into the story, and Dar would be able to have a moment with Anakin. And it wasn't the interest of Arturo or Toga, but it was of interest to the boy Lumber and Hellscream, the players, because they knew what to watch for. They watched several moments where Anakin would go and do things. And there was one moment actually where they were told to arrive there with their masters, and they were speaking with the Supreme Chancellor Palpatine, who was already there talking to Anakin. And at some point after getting their assignment, he kind of brushes the party away and takes Anakin by the shoulder and leads him away. And it gave this very uncomfortable chill through several of them because they're fans of the story. They know how Anakin was groomed by Palpatine. And so eventually the Attack of the Clones happens, and at this point we had added another player. I'm going to call him Spaceman because that was his handle. And he made a very, very effective character that was a Makashi duelist that also subclassed into Sarisu Defender. Absolutely mad. And he ends up losing his master during the Battle of Geonosis. And then, by surviving the Battle of Geonosis, this is a great time to have them take the trials. And so, they're going through, they did the thing, they passed their checks, and then I have them roll Force dice. And depending on how they rolled, you know, white for light side, dark for dark side, or a mixture of the two, I had them experience a Force vision that was then flavored by their Force result. And I said, you know, this is where you are going in. Describe to me how you are as a Jedi Knight. And then they would describe that. And then I said, okay, all right. Now, how do you die? And the entire mood of the table changed immediately. Because then, this gives them agency over their character arc. They can tell me where they want to end up. Arturo ends up stepping out onto Alderaan. He said, you know, I think that I'm a little bit older. You know, I kind of sprang this on the boy Lumber. So he said, okay, well, you know, help me out with it. Let me see. Yes. So you want to be on Alderaan, okay? Peaceful, okay. All right. And so, you know, wish fulfillment, kind of cringe maybe, but I said, okay, when you come out of your home and you're drinking some water and you look up into the sky to witness the beautiful views of your home world, and then you realize that there's a second moon, and he immediately got it. I am of course referring to the Death Star here. And giving him that through line from Attack of the Clones to A New Hope gave him a scope. He could be a Jedi survivor. Also, this is before anything with Cal Kestis. Anything with the Obi-Wan Kenobi show. And so as these games and things were coming out, it ended up becoming a very a joke among us, like, oh, Disney's got Jeff's phones tapped. You know. But I don't claim any originality in that. Anybody who's versed or not versed in the lore could have come to those same conclusions with the way things worked out, the design, things like that. And during the Clone Wars, I ended up giving them their own Padawans. And something interesting happened a few years before the Revenge of the Sith. I said, okay, well, they've been gathering XP over this long war. Do you allow them to take the trials? Darth Maul had a human Padawan with a vague hint to some lineage. We'll call her Bastille because that was what her name was. And Darth Maul actually said, and he was the only one, by the way, to not spec into Jedi General. He went straight into Jedi Master. So, okay. That's okay. And then he denied his Padawan the ability to take the Jedi trials. And that caused some friction, but it was great. Arturo allowed his Keldor apprentice, Kel Turan, to take, and we rolled, and Kel became a Jedi Knight. And Toga ended up having a Twi'lek apprentice of his own that he trained in opposition to him. You see, Toga was a Colossus, and so he trained a Makashi duelist. Very cool. And she ended up passing as well. And so you get this really long lived in sense of time. And there were so many stories that I can't even really go into, but they really embodied their characters. They had tons of time. They spent over probably 20, 25, maybe even 30 sessions. That was done nearly weekly or bi-weekly for about a year, maybe a year and a half. Which is why I say it's the second longest, because my main campaign right now has been going on for 3 years. And that's proper D&D. But when I called my campaign was Star Wars The Dark Times, because they were assumably going to go through it. They had a Star Wars saga of their own, and I haven't had the long-lived experience of having players experience that amount of time ever since. In my D&D campaign, we've been playing for 2.5, 3 years, and we're only a year and a month in the timeline. But I learned a lot through that Star Wars campaign. I learned about player commitment, player buy-in was huge in that campaign. But also how to give them what they want and give them what they need. And you can do both. I'd love to get Hunterman or Hellscream or even the Boy Lumber in on the podcast actually to talk about it in depth, because I'm sure that they remember things that I don't even remember. And of course, you've got to add in a ton of things that aren't canon, but I mean, again, it was a game. I don't really know why I feel the need to justify that. I mean, we had ancient Sith. Actually, we had 3 of them. And they were dark side spirits that had learned to take control of corporeal beings and possess them. And so that was that was the way I got around the Bane Knight rule of 2. I mean, obviously, there can be dark side users, even dark Jedi, but there cannot be true Sith unless they came from a different doctrine or a different time than that of Darth Bane. And so these were. I'll even lay into this. One of them was Darth Kreia, and she became this sort of almost, if you're a fan of Naruto, her character arc in that campaign was very Orochimaru-like, because I loved the idea of Kreia and what she stood for. At the time, I remember playing a lot of the Sith Lords, and I was enamored by the fact that somebody could be a Sith, but not really, or not the way I think of Sith. The same can be true of the Jedi, because Kreia was a Jedi first. And you get this person who can't stand absolute evil. Really, Kreia was the first time, and really this is BioWare, or it's not BioWare, it's Obsidian, creating a character that subverts the typical trope. Because she was not a good person. But she wasn't evil. not absolute evil. Palpatine, Sheev Palpatine, Darth Sidious, is absolutely evil. Freya was not. And I could get into an entire thing, but this is a podcast about tabletops. So that leads me into my current campaign. I call it The Heroes of the Multiverse, and the party is not chronically online, so I actually don't have very good handles. But I have some of my very closest friends. Actually, at the time of recording this, it's about 10:21 p.m. on January 31st. Tomorrow is our first session in 3 months. And I remember not anticipating the big break because we're in the middle of a boss fight just started happening, an encounter down in the Underdark, and the other, we split the party also. The other half of the party, well, so it's a group of 7. 2 of them are at court with the human kingdom, and the other 5, with some NPCs, are down in the Underdark, struggling against essentially the Chamber of Secrets basilisk. But think like gloom. I could really talk a lot about the Heroes of the Multiverse because that has turned into one of the greatest world-building exercises I have ever experienced. I have written over 503 Obsidian Vault file notes. And it is, without exaggerating, it's my Westeros. It's my Middle Earth. And if I ever did anything with it, adapted it into anything, I would have to obviously change the name of several of the races. But the Heroes of the Multiverse are comprised of a Dragonborn Paladin Sorcerer, Kriv Savarak, a Bard Rogue Tabaxi by name of Moonstone on the Cliff, but we call her Moon. She has a charlatan background and a hidden identity as she's a College of Whispers Bard, but she operates her face as though she is an eloquence bard by the name of Radiant Ruby. And this is, before I go on, this is this party's first campaign ever. And the player buy-in for something that is not already established like Star Wars is insane. Kriv Savarak's player, we'll call him Griffin because he actually has commented on the channel before. Griffin has written lore about this Dragonborn and really his enemy, this dragon in which his heritage comes from, known as the Frozen Fury. He has helped write an encounter, a boss battle, that will be absolutely titanic. And then we've got Moonstone, or Moon. Phenomenal, very tragic character, and probably the voice of reason and realism like I've never seen, because it's very easy to go into the whole this is a story, I'm meant to succeed. Moon and her player comes at it from such a real place. Why are we doing this? Is one of Moon's go-to phrases, because she makes me consider what the group is doing if they weren't being avatared by a bunch of nerdy friends. Why are we doing this? Oh, it's a quest. No, but why are we doing this? And it checks me as a game master every single session. She keeps me honest. Then there is Zini, a little satyr life domain cleric who has just recently gone into shadow sorcery. And I remember during session 0, we were doing character building. And she said, well, I just don't know, Jeff. I want to be able to help. I said, okay, well, help is great. Do you want to be a healer? Yeah. So she makes this little satyr girl, little flower girl satyr, with all of the cutest little flower petals and everything like that. And she's very, very withdrawn, everything like that. Just wants to help. I remember she helped a quest giver in the first town by healing his jaw when it had been wired shut. And so he was able to give better information and eventually lead into the trick that the bounty that they were going to go into was false, though that was handled by Moon with some subterfuge interrogation. And during one of the first encounters, she ends up hilariously, and I can get into this in another episode, she gets the taste of blood because she has taken inflict wounds, and she absolutely murders a mako shark. What do you get when you mix a GM who's always been afraid of the Jaws movies with a dragonborn paladin who compels duel? You get something that probably comes out of Sharknado. And so that is how the paladin ended up in a grapple with a mako shark, and the cleric ended up disintegrating the underbelly of that shark. And she got the taste for blood, and it has never left. I almost asked her one time if she wanted to respec into a war domain cleric. And as she has gone on and she's failed, she's succeeded many times, but in the very moments that she's failed to be a healer, she has opened up a great character arc for loss. And really, a great question for all of us to ask. When you can't help something, when your means just can't make it, what means will you turn to? What line is too far if you're trying to save somebody? We also joke that you don't have to heal your friends if you kill things that try to hurt your friends, but I like the other one better. Then we have the player behind two characters, actually. Her first was a fighter, champion, or a battle master, by the name of Margot Mistra, who was built like a Myrmidon, or even a Spartan hoplite. Spear, short sword, and shield. Fantastic. Margot is the youngest daughter of a Sea Lord in our world, and she is the voice of reason without being morally like a paladin. Even the paladin's a little bloodthirsty for a paladin, but that's also been changing. But this fighter was the heart of the group. No, we're going to do this because it's the right thing. And I'm sorry that you can't see that right now. Margot was awesome. She could hold her own, completely non-magical except for her inherent Triton abilities. She would banter. The player behind Margot is very naturally witty, and going back and forth with this paladin who has the numbers down. and has banter of his own. But to go toe to toe during combat, it's so cinematic. And at some point during the middle of the campaign, she came to me and she said, I just don't, I feel like I'm a one-trick pony. I don't feel like I'm really doing a whole lot. I'd like to do more, but I don't want to commit to something crazy like a wizard. And I said, okay, well, what about a warlock? Magic light, but you're always very potent. Okay, yeah, so she comes back with this character called Azara, who is a tiefling warlock, a great old one, patron. Pact of the book, the tome. And so I went, okay, well, I've got to start making gods or beings. But Azara is absolutely terrifying. And something that is very fascinating is that this player has often told me that the character scares the player as well. And this reminds me of a general truth. When you make a character, especially when you're making your first couple, I think that you inadvertently make your first character very much like you. However, when you make your second character, I think that it's a much more focused idea, but it is also another aspect of yourself, or an idea that you feel like you need to interface with. And Azara is a withdrawn but manipulated manipulator. So she is a manipulated person who has turned to manipulation because it is what she knows from her patron. She talks with this patron, Zalthor, which, hilariously, this is my favorite god in the entire lore. The god of forbidden knowledge. And he talks to her mostly through a diary where it'll write itself, kind of like Tom Riddle's diary from Harry Potter. And she is extremely introspective, but she also has no filter. She's very impulse driven, but also it's such a great character. I adore watching Azara. And then we've got our little druid, Varaya. Now, Varaya comes from a player who has never played tabletops before, other than, a couple of one-shots. And when I make a character, or when I bring a character in, I really like to put the player into the world. With Vampire the Masquerade, I didn't have to make the world. They could just tell me where in our town they came from. In this world, a world I call Perdea, in a region called the Basin of Man, I said, okay, well, where are you from? Well, I kind of want to be an elf. Well, this is where most of the elves come from. And you're able to, cooperatively collaborate and make this character. And so Varaya is a early elf. She's an Eladrin. She's a druid of the Circle of the Moon. And so this kept coming to mind, this aspect, this relationship with the moon. And she's the survivor of a druid ritual where something had happened in her backstory that made her a prime candidate to be sacrificed. So I take that and I go, okay, well, Circle of the Moon, druid. What if she was born during an eclipse? At the time, me and the player of Varaya had been talking about several aspects of that, and The Witcher kept coming to mind with the eclipse-born children that were being hunted down by the wizard. You can see that depicted in season 1 of The Witcher, and Infree. Great concept, except Varaya is this very chaotic neutral to neutral good character who is thrust with responsibility. She's a healer, and she's trying to keep everybody okay, but she has the feralness and the ferocity of the wild. Somebody who actually comes to mind, and until I was saying this, I actually haven't been a fan of, but in Critical Role Campaign 4, Abria Iyengar, phenomenal person, great GM, and great player, is playing an orc druid named Taisha. And the mom instincts, the very feral, I need to protect you, the almost animalistic tendencies are a little bit more subdued in Varaya because she's such a younger character, but is the same. So I get that nature, that very natural, protective aspect, and she's trying her best to understand why what happened to her happened, how she can salvage her connections from her past, or if she's simply got to go forward and try to do the best that she can. And I'm really excited to see where that ends up. Wow. I've been talking for an hour and 12 minutes now. And I could go on. I have a DMPC called Zenith. He's a wizard because they needed a wizard, honestly. But also, I'm so sorry I forgot. Our newest member, a character, Griffin's wife, plays an Azamar, a winged Azamar, named Appalachia. And Appalachia is the second character of this player. Phenomenal player. So roleplay heavy that she will often, third character of this player, she values the stats, but stats are forever secondary to character. And that is, I can't brag if you ever hear this, Appalachia, that is where I'm at. I mean, Griffin is great at the numbers. I often have to rely on him for quick math. The dedication to character, that fully formed personality. Once you knew who Appalachia was within 3 sentences of her speaking. And we make what we are enthralled by. At the time, she was reading a historical fiction about a Slavic Eastern European woman trying to survive in post-World War II Europe. Phenomenal. And that hard, gruff, but still very neutral, but also you can tell that her morals are there. It's a foundation. But her lived experience has made her more cautious, but also very frank. Appalachia comes from a part of the world called Loath, and it is a place of monsters. And from a very young age, she had to learn how to survive in this place, especially without her mother. And she has become a courier because of her speed, but she's also become a monster hunter. She's a ranger. And man, if you backbone, this is the loner that became the backbone because something about the group drew her in. Very early for the character. Varaya and Appalachia are very new characters. Azara is technically new, but the player is not. Phenomenal stuff. I keep saying that, but really I'm so impressed by people that were not interested in this hobby before it was pitched by some of our friends that unfortunately had to drop out. Their characters were Gwyn, a centaur monk, forever cool, and Nadric, this exiled king of dwarves, from the far south due to a treacherous brother. It has been their characters that have fueled the world building for the world of Perdea. And in the grand timeline of the world, I anticipate the heroes of the multiverse, or as their last self-proclaimed name were, the Crack-A-Lackans. It's the heroes of the multiverse. Until they can tell me what name they've decided on, because events happened. Anyway, it has been a privilege to GM for this group in particular, and we don't get to meet all that often, but when we do, it's great. It's so varied, and it's current. It's still ongoing, and hopefully they can become heroes, if not more, of the world, so that if I ever get to run a campaign 2 in this world, they can make characters several hundred years later that could have been inspired by where they've been already. And there's a legacy there. It will feel lived in because they lived it. But yeah, that was just kind of an off-the-cuff reintroduction to the topic of talking tabletops on the channel. This has been a lone GM, Jeff the narrator, just talking about a little bit about my journey. I can't believe that was an hour and 18 minutes. Huh. If you enjoy the content, if you enjoy the talk, the sort of ramble, I'm going to do some edits to make sure that some of the drawn out pauses or tangents aren't so bad, but it'll mostly be uncut. And if you enjoy that sort of thing, put a comment. Tell me what you would like to talk about, or would like for me to talk about on this podcast, because tabletop role-playing games are such a still emerging... How can something still be emerging? It is one of those cyclical things that keeps re-emerging because the concept is so much older than what we realize. From ancient war games to probably, the invention of role-playing, specifically Braunstein. If you know, you know. And then going into the 70s, the resurgences and everything like that, and then we've got people like Critical Role, who recorded an actual play, campaign, performed it live, I believe it was their finale, did another 2 campaigns, and are adapting campaigns 1 and 2 into animated series. I mean, that is just the dream, and it just began with a group of friends around a table with probably no lights, way too much snacks, and way too much table talk. And they had a great time. And there are stories that'll come out of this hobby that dwarf anything coming out of Hollywood. We are a people, we are a species of storytellers. It's in our blood, it's in our culture. Why should we be surprised when we start telling stories? And they are so profound and beyond anything that we could have imagined. So that's where I'll leave you today. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, for tuning into this little table talk. Talking tabletops. I don't know. It might be called table talk. We'll see. I'm thinking with talking tabletops, but I'll see if I can even say that. I hope you're having a wonderful day. And maybe after today's talk you understand a little bit more about why I end my videos the way I do. Because I do hope you're having a great day. And as always, not just me, but you, keep telling stories.